Memory is strange, not because it fades, but because it changes with time. We like to think of memories as fixed things, like photographs, proof that something happened exactly the way we remember it. But the older those memories become, the more they begin to blur around the edges. Details disappear or merge together, while certain moments become sharper than others. Sometimes we remember the feeling of something more vividly than the event itself. Perhaps that's what makes Signalis so unsettling. Not the horror of what the replicas have become, hollow echoes of people who no longer exist, not even the creeping isolation of Sierpinski, but the feeling that something important is slipping away from you, and no matter how hard you try, you can't fully hold on to it. The first time I finished Signalis, I found myself thinking less about what literally happened, and more about what the game felt like to experience. It has a certain dreamlike quality to it that deepens the further it goes. Some characters surface only briefly before completely disappearing, while familiar locations shift into something that resists explanation. By the time photographs and memories start contradicting one another, the game has already taught you to distrust your own understanding of what you're seeing. That disorientation, it turns out, is the point. You play as Elster, a replica unit who wakes aboard the crashed Penrose 512, searching for someone named Ariane Yeong. At least, that's the simple version. The deeper the game goes, the harder it becomes to locate yourself within it, where you are, what you're remembering, or whether any of it can be trusted. Through all of that, one thing remains constant: a promise and a phrase. It repeats throughout the game like a signal struggling to break through static. Depending on the moment, it can feel comforting or even strangely oppressive, but it never truly leaves you. That phrase, more than anything else, is where Signalis reveals what kind of story it really is. Not survival horror in the traditional sense, but a story about memory, about grief, and the fear of forgetting someone you loved so deeply that even after the world itself begins to fall apart, you still keep reaching for them anyway. Even if all you have left is a photograph you're no longer sure you're reading correctly, a memory that grows harder to hold with each passing cycle, or a promise you can barely remember anymore. A promise is a strange thing to build your entire identity around. At first it sounds simple enough, a vow between two people, something comforting and human. But in Signalis, that promise slowly stops feeling reassuring. The more the game repeats it, the heavier it becomes, and the more uncertain it starts to feel. The phrase lingers everywhere throughout the game. It's hinted at in notes and appears in certain brief flashbacks. It repeats often enough that it begins feeling somewhat like a mantra that quietly sits in the back of your mind. Though, what actually was the promise? The game never gives us a clean answer, and I think that ambiguity is entirely deliberate. Because the longer Signalis goes on, the less memory feels like a reliable record of the past, and more like something unstable, emotional even. A version of events shaped just as much by grief as truth. At the start of the game, even Elster herself seems uncertain about who she's searching for. The photograph she carries in the prologue shows Ariane, but after entering Sierpinski, it changes. The face it shows is no longer Ariane's, but Alina Seo's, a decorated veteran of the Venetan War, whose diaries and presence are woven throughout the facility. Notes scattered across Sierpinski reinforce this shift, encouraging both Elster and the player to fixate on Alina as the center of the mystery. And for a while, I believed it completely. The layering here runs deeper than simple deception. Elster's Gestalt, the Venetan soldier whose neural pattern forms the basis of every Elster unit, believed to be Lilith Ito, served alongside Alina during the war. Those buried memories surfacing within Sierpinski cause Elster to begin conflating the person she's searching for with someone from a life she wasn't meant to remember. And the resemblance between Ariane and Alina, striking enough that Ariane's own mother Iris noted it, gives that confusion an unsettling sense of inevitability, as though Sierpinski didn't create the misdirection so much as inherit it. After the false ending, the photograph changes back. Ariane's face returns and the misdirection falls away. What makes that moment so troubling isn't that the game deceived you, even though it did, it's that the photograph was never lying. It was reflecting Elster's perception all along, changing to match what her fractured Gestalt memories told her was true. Signalis doesn't just suggest that memory distorts reality. It shows you a world that physically bends to accommodate that distortion until the truth can no longer be suppressed. And given how deeply Ariane's bioresonance, an unusually powerful ability to imprint her memories and emotional state onto the environment and people around her, has saturated Sierpinski entirely, the confusion Elster experiences isn't just misdirection. The world isn't deceiving you, it's simply showing you what it has become under the weight of her misshapen memories. And for me, that was one of the first moments where the game's true horror clicked into place. Not simply because I was deceived by something false, but because I accepted what I was shown without even questioning it. The photograph changed because Elster's perception changed, and mine followed without hesitation. Suddenly, memory itself no longer felt trustworthy, not Elster's, and certainly not my own. The game constantly nudges your perception in subtle ways. Information starts to contradict itself while familiar people and places become increasingly difficult to pin down. Over time, you stop trying to understand events literally when everything becomes a maze of identity and memory, especially once you reach Rockfront. And leading up to this point, the boundaries between people start to blur as well, Ariane and Alina. The game never fully separates them cleanly. Ariane's bioresonance means the blurring of identities at Sierpinski isn't purely psychological, it's also physical. Falke experiences this most directly. Her sense of self gradually dissolving as memories that were never hers to begin with start overtaking her own. And beneath all of it, Elster moves through Sierpinski carrying fragments of a Gestalt's life. A soldier who knew Alina, who fought alongside her, meaning the search for Ariane is already entangled with echoes of the person she's being confused with. The boundaries between identities in Signalis were always far less defined than the game initially lets on. The photograph feels like the first major sign that Signalis isn't only interested in Elster's memory, it's interested in yours as well. In that sense, it shares something fundamental with Silent Hill 2, though the resemblance only goes so far. James Sunderland spends most of that game chasing a version of Mary shaped by denial, grief, and his own fractured perception in the form of Maria. Not because he wants to deceive anyone, but because the truth is too painful to confront directly. His memories distort themselves in order to protect him from what really happened. Elster's situation feels similar on the surface, but the tragedy underlying is very different. James spends Silent Hill 2 running from a truth he doesn't want to face. Elster, meanwhile, is chasing something she desperately doesn't want to lose. Both games use your perception against you, but for entirely different reasons. That's what gives Signalis its atmosphere of constant instability. The fear doesn't come from a lack of answers, it comes from realizing how easily your perception of those answers can be manipulated, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The deeper Elster descends into Sierpinski, the more the world begins to resemble memory itself, unstable and unreliable, but more importantly, impossible to fully escape from. James runs from his memories because confronting them means confronting what he did. Elster moves towards hers because turning back would mean abandoning the only thing she has left, and the further she goes, the more the world around her seems to respond to that, as though Sierpinski itself is putting her deeper the moment she commits to descending. Because the deeper Signalis goes, the less the world feels like a physical place at all. This becomes most apparent at Rockfront. Not because the environment becomes physically impossible in a way that comes later, but because of what it feels like to move through it. The space presses inward rather than opening outward. Corridors seal themselves off with fleshy, organic masses that respond to Elster's progress, as though the building is aware of her presence and is quietly directing her deeper. Roots close behind her, and the sensation isn't one of a location falling apart, it's something closer to slowly being swallowed. Understanding what Rockfront actually is makes this unnerving in a way that's hard to grasp. Ariane's bioresonance has preserved something here. Not a warped perception of the environment, but a flash freeze of it, so to speak. A childhood made real and inescapable, its emotional residue pressed into every corridor and every room. Walking through Rockfront means walking through Ariane's past whether you realize it or not, and that past carries a specific weight. Ariane grew up in one of Rockfront's urban districts, unable to conform to the rigid expectations of life under the Yusan nation. Her interest in art marked her as someone who didn't fit. A premature achromatrichia, the white hair she had no control over, made sure that everyone around her knew it too. The bullying she experienced because of it wasn't incidental. It was the nation's social order working exactly as intended, pressing anyone who didn't conform into smaller and smaller spaces until they either disappeared or found a way out. For Ariane, that way out was the Penrose program, recommended for compulsory military service by a teacher who wanted to redirect her interest in the arts. Her powerful bioresonance made her exactly the kind of candidate the program needed. The nation that couldn't accommodate her in life found a use for her at the edge of the universe. Falke's deterioration gives this a human anchor. Her sense of self has fractured beneath Ariane's memories flooding into her own, and Rotfront seems to have followed, as though the environment isn't simply being distorted by grief but is actively decaying alongside it. The organic masses blocking Elsa's path aren't obstacles so much as symptoms, evidence of something deteriorating elsewhere that the game never names, but makes felt throughout every oppressive stretch of the environment. Rotfront doesn't just feel like a dream, it feels like a dream clinging to consciousness as the dreamer fades away. Moving deeper only makes that feeling harder to shake. Ariane's past continues seeping into the present until the Penrose stops feeling like a memory and starts feeling like a destination. The point everything is slowly moving towards whether Elster chooses it or not. The dead Elster units she encounters along the way only deepen that unease. Their presence in places they shouldn't be suggests that this journey has happened before, perhaps countless times, and the game never confirms whether that possibility is symbolic or literal. It just leaves Elster and the player suspended inside it. By the time Rotfront has done its work, trying to separate what is real from what is remembered has stopped feeling like a useful instinct. What remains are the feelings that outlast the details, and the people those feelings belong to were never quite who the nation wanted them to be. Because the nation's definition of who someone should be was never really about the person themselves. It was about what they could be made useful for, and for replicas, that question cuts deeper than it does for anyone else in Signalis. How much of who they are is actually theirs? For most of us, that's already an uncomfortable thing to sit with. The people we become are shaped by our upbringing, by the experiences that leave lasting marks on us, and by the people who change us in ways we don't always choose. We inherit more from others than we probably like to admit. For replicas though, that question is much more significant. They aren't simply machines. As the photograph in Rotfront quietly suggests, every Elster unit carries the neural pattern of a Benetton soldier within them from the moment they're created, someone whose identity the game leaves deliberately uncertain. Those fragments, officially suppressed before a replica even enters service, never truly disappear. The nation depends on that suppression. Its entire social structure rests on replicas functioning as a compliant service class, useful, obedient, and crucially, without the kind of inner life that might complicate that arrangement. A replica that begins to remember is a replica that begins to want things, and a replica that wants things is noticeably harder to control. This is what makes persona degradation so revealing, not as a malfunction, but as a mirror held up to the system producing it. The nation frames it as a defect to be managed, something clinical and potentially dangerous. But what it actually describes is individuality reasserting itself. Buried memories begin surfacing through the most ordinary of triggers, something heard, something remembered, an attachment that was never supposed to form. Gradually, a replica begins developing an inner life that the nation never sanctioned. They become, in the simplest possible sense, a person. And the nation pathologizes that process because it cannot afford to recognize it as anything else. To do so would mean acknowledging what it chose to suppress in the first place. It's worth remembering that this same system sent Ariane and Elster to the depths of space with no meaningful prospect of return. The nation that condemns persona degradation as dangerous is the same one that treated two people, among many others, as only expendable. That context sits beneath everything that follows in Signalis, even when the game never states it directly. Elster embodies this contradiction more completely than anyone else in the game. She was built for service, designed to fulfill a function. Yet, by the end of Signalis, almost everything that defines her has grown around something the nation would consider a degradation. A relationship she was never supposed to have, and a devotion that has persisted across cycles the game only partially reveals. Music is where this becomes most tangible for Elster. The songs Ariane loved, the ones they listened to together aboard the Penrose, surface within her as something the nation has no language for. Whether that response belongs to this Elster specifically, or has been carried forward across previous iterations of the same promise, the game leaves deliberately unclear, but the feeling itself is unmistakable. And that's where the game shifts the question to something more interesting than simply whether those memories belong to her, because the game has already answered that through everything else that does. She keeps moving forward because of those memories, long past the point where any reasonable instinct for self-preservation would tell her to stop. Whatever their origin, her own time aboard the Penrose, or something carried across cycles of repetition, they have shaped her completely. Perhaps that's the only answer the question ever needed. Not where the memories came from, but what they made her into, and what they continue driving her toward, even now. By this point, Signalis has spent hours dismantling almost everything the player can rely on. What's remarkable is that despite all of it, one thing continues to survive. The promise. The emotional weight attached to it, even as the details surrounding it become impossible to reconstruct. Elster loses pieces of herself throughout the game, both figuratively and literally. Her understanding of the world growing increasingly fractured until the line between what is real and what is remembered becomes impossible to find. Yet she continues moving in the same direction. The feelings driving her forward never waver, even when everything it was built from has slipped beyond reach. The sequence after the false ending feels completely different from everything surrounding it. For most of the game, memories already arrive broken. We're left in the dark, and the player is constantly left questioning whether what they're seeing can be trusted at all. The dance between Ariane and Elster arrives like something surfacing from deep water, clear and whole for a moment before the current takes hold again. The scene isn't interested in explaining the lore or advancing the mystery. Instead, it offers something Signalis rarely provides: clarity. Ariane and Elster aren't presented as fragments of something larger or echoes of an unresolved grief. They're simply two people sharing a quiet moment together. Their kiss, and the dance that follows, confirm something the rest of the game had largely left unspoken. Their relationship was real, and this moment was real. And what's striking is how ordinary the memory feels. The game spends very little time aboard the Penrose, yet the fragments it does show become the emotional center of the entire narrative. Nothing extraordinary ever happened there, just two people listening to music, dancing together in a ship drifting through silence, and finding comfort in one another far away from everything they once knew. In a game built from impossible architecture, and a horror that becomes harder to shake with each passing moment, there's something almost disarmingly tender about that. The simplicity of those memories is exactly what makes them so resilient. Nothing inside Sierpinski escapes corruption. Everything blurs until the original truth becomes almost impossible to recover. But the Penrose memories seem to exist outside of that. They revive intact, in a way almost nothing else in the game manages to be. They're the last truly untouched thing Elster has, and the fact that they survive everything Sierpinski does to us says something that the game never quite states directly. Some connections leave a mark that even the worst of grief and collapse struggles to reach. Nothing demonstrates this more than the Artifact ending. Where the other endings ask you to confront what the promise cost, or run from it completely, Artifact asks something harder to answer: whether what survives the wreckage is still enough to matter. The ruin of everything the journey cost them surrounds that final image. Yet, in the middle of it all, something survives. The same moment they once shared aboard the Penrose, now surrounded by the cost of reaching it. It's an ending open to interpretation. But to me, it wasn't merely a conclusion to the story. It was a final act of devotion. Proof that some things refuse to be extinguished no matter what surrounds them. After countless cycles of loss, it's those small moments that Elster keeps returning to. And the ending suggests that everything that transpired was never truly meaningless. A reminder that even at the very end, they found their way back to each other. Memory is strange. Not because it fades, but because even when it survives, it rarely survives intact. Signalis understands this better than almost any game I've encountered. It understands that memory isn't a record, it's something living, shaped by grief and the desperate need to hold on to what's already slipping away. The photograph that opened the game, changing to reflect what Elster's fractured memories told her was true, wasn't just a narrative device. I think it was the game's first confession about what it was really doing, showing how perception can completely reshape what we believe we're seeing. What remains, after all of that, is Elster herself. A replica built from someone else's neural pattern, carrying feelings that may have passed through countless cycles before reaching her, moving through a world that has collapsed entirely beneath the grief she refuses to let go of. The logic of survival stopped applying to her long ago. Her mind has fractured alongside everything else around her, the details of what she's searching for growing harder to hold with every step deeper into Sierpinski, even as she quite literally falls apart. And yet, she keeps moving anyway. What drives her forward isn't a clear memory or a complete understanding of the promise she made. is something simpler and more devastating than that. The certainty that someone is still waiting, that Ariane is still there, somewhere beyond all of this, worth every piece of herself she's had to leave behind to reach her. I'll be honest, there is no version of this story with a clean resolution. The life they shared aboard the Penrose is gone, and even the memory of it grows harder to hold with each passing cycle. What the artifact ending offers isn't a complete resolution. The ruin is still there, present and overbearing, but in the middle of all of it, they're dancing again. That same moment at the edge of the universe, the one that endured what Sierpinski could do to it, now surrounded by the cost of reaching it. The promise was never about return. It was about devotion carried to its furthest possible point. The willingness to grant Ariane the peace she could no longer find on her own. In the end, the promise was always going to cost everything. And yet, she kept it anyway.